It was a bright morning at JFK International Airport, the bustling terminal filled with travelers of all kinds. Among them was Officer James Carter, a well-dressed man with a calm demeanor and sharp eyes. James wasn't just any passenger. He was an off-duty FBI agent returning home after a long assignment. His badge and firearm were carefully stored as per protocol, his presence unassuming yet commanding. Despite the crowded atmosphere, James carried himself with a quiet confidence, his purpose hidden behind his relaxed appearance. Meanwhile, in the first-class boarding line, a flight attendant named Claire was preparing for what she assumed would be another uneventful day. Claire had always prided herself on running a tight ship, often enforcing policies with an iron will. Yet, her sense of authority sometimes came with an air of superiority, one that rubbed certain passengers the wrong way. Today, her patience was already wearing thin, and her gaze swept over the boarding passengers with an air of quiet judgment. James approached the counter, his ticket in hand. Polite but direct, he greeted Claire as he handed over his boarding pass. Claire's eyes flicked from the ticket to James, then back to the ticket, her expression tightening ever so slightly. There was a moment of hesitation, one James noticed but chose to ignore. Claire scanned the ticket, her tone clipped as she spoke. "Sir, can I see some identification?" she asked, her voice lacking the warmth she had used moments earlier with other passengers. James raised an eyebrow but complied, pulling out his government-issued ID. Claire barely glanced at it before handing it back. Her demeanor suggested she was searching for something, anything that might disqualify him from taking his seat. As James walked down the jet bridge, Claire's unease seemed to grow. She whispered to a colleague, her tone carrying a mix of suspicion and disdain. "I just don't feel comfortable with him on this flight," she said, her eyes narrowing. The colleague hesitated, clearly unsure of what to make of Claire's remarks. When James reached his seat in first class, he settled in and pulled out a book, completely unaware of the storm brewing. A few minutes later, Claire approached, her expression firm. "Sir, I need you to step off the plane," she said, her voice loud enough to draw the attention of nearby passengers. James looked up, confused. "Is there a problem?" he asked calmly, though the tension in his voice was evident. "It's a matter of security," Claire replied, her tone leaving no room for discussion. James hesitated for a moment before standing, his training urging him to remain composed. As he followed Claire back toward the boarding gate, whispers spread among the other passengers. When they reached the gate, James finally spoke up. "I'd like to know the specific reason for this," he said, his voice steady but firm. Claire faltered for a moment before stating, "I have the right to remove anyone I believe is a threat." James took a deep breath, his mind racing. He wasn't just an off-duty officer. He was a decorated FBI agent with years of service protecting people like Claire. But instead of revealing his credentials, he simply said, "I think there's been a misunderstanding." Claire stood her ground, but her confidence began to waver as a supervisor approached, alerted by the commotion. Before James could say more, another passenger, a young woman who had witnessed the exchange, stepped forward. "Excuse me, but I don't think he's done anything wrong," she said, her voice shaking slightly. Her courage only seemed to frustrate Claire further. As the situation escalated, James decided it was time to speak up, his tone measured but firm. "Ma'am, I think it's important you understand who I am before this goes any further," he said, reaching into his pocket. But before he could reveal his badge, the supervisor interrupted. "Let's take a moment to review the situation," they said, attempting to de-escalate the tension. Claire folded her arms, her expression defiant. James, however, remained calm, his training as an agent allowing him to read the room with precision. The moment hung in the air, thick with tension. Passengers peered out from their seats, their curiosity piqued by the unfolding drama. And as James prepared to reveal the truth about his identity, Claire's decision was about to set off a chain of events she could never have anticipated. The room felt charged with unspoken words as James remained standing by the boarding gate. He could feel the weight of every eye on him, the whispers of passengers blending into a low hum. Claire stood a few feet away, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her expression unreadable but her stance rigid. The supervisor, caught between mediating the scene and diffusing a potentially bad look for the airline, was flipping through James's ticket and ID with increasing uncertainty. For James, the moments dragged, but his focus remained sharp. Years of working in high-pressure situations as an FBI agent had taught him the value of patience. He studied Claire's body language, noting her discomfort. It wasn't just about him. There was something deeper driving her actions. and James suspected it had little to do with security protocols. The young woman who had spoken up earlier lingered nearby, her face a mix of indignation and worry. James gave her a quick nod of thanks, silently acknowledging her bravery. It wasn't easy to challenge authority, especially in a setting where most people preferred to avoid confrontation. She glanced at Claire, then back at James, as if waiting to see how this would unfold. Finally, the supervisor broke the silence. "Mr. Carter, your credentials check out, but the flight attendant here expressed concerns about safety. Could you clarify if there's anything we should be aware of?" James took a breath. He had hoped it wouldn't come to this, but he understood the importance of context. Reaching into his jacket, he carefully pulled out his badge, flipping it open for the supervisor and Claire to see. The small emblem gleamed under the fluorescent lights, the letters FBI unmistakable. "I'm a federal agent," James said, his tone even. "I've flown hundreds of times without issue. I'd like to know what's changed today." The supervisor's face shifted, a mix of surprise and embarrassment creeping in. They glanced at Claire, who stiffened. Her lips pressed into a thin line, but she didn't say anything. The pause stretched uncomfortably, and James didn't miss the subtle way Claire's gaze darted around as if searching for an out. The supervisor cleared their throat. "This is unusual. Miss Claire, do you have any specific reasons for asking Mr. Carter to deplane?" Claire's jaw tightened. "It's not about his credentials," she said, her voice lower now but still edged with defiance. "He just gave me a bad feeling. Sometimes intuition is enough, especially when it comes to passenger safety." James raised an eyebrow, his patience beginning to wear thin. "Intuition?" he repeated, his tone calm but pointed. "Let me make this clear. I expect my career protecting this country. If you're going to accuse me of something, you'd better have more than a feeling." The supervisor looked uncomfortable, clearly unsure of how to navigate the situation. Around them, the passengers who had disembarked to stretch their legs were openly watching now, their curiosity piqued. The murmurs grew louder, snippets of conversation reaching James's ears. "Is he in trouble? He's FBI. Why would they question him? This doesn't seem right." The young woman stepped forward again, her voice trembling but resolute. "This isn't fair. He hasn't done anything wrong. I saw how she looked at him when he first boarded. It was clear she had an issue with him from the start." Claire shot at her a sharp look, but the woman didn't back down. James felt a flicker of gratitude, but he knew he couldn't rely on the kindness of strangers to resolve this. He turned back to the supervisor. "I'd like to continue with my travel plans," he said firmly. "If there's a legitimate issue, I'm more than happy to address it. But I wouldn't stand here and be treated like a criminal without reason." The supervisor hesitated, their gaze shifting between James and Claire. It was clear they were trying to balance the demands of protocol with the need to maintain the airline's image. Finally, they nodded. "Let me confer with the captain," they said, motioning for James to wait. They walked briskly toward the cockpit, leaving James and Claire in an awkward standoff. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Claire, her voice low and laced with something that sounded almost like frustration, said, "I was just doing my job. You don't understand the pressure we're under." James tilted his head, studying her. "You're right. I don't understand. Because this isn't about pressure. This is about something else entirely. And I think you know that." Claire didn't respond, but the flicker of guilt in her eyes spoke volumes. Before James could press further, the supervisor returned, the captain trailing behind. The captain, a tall man with a no-nonsense demeanor, introduced himself quickly and cut straight to the point. "Agent Carter, I've been briefed," he said. "You're clear to reboard and will ensure there are no further distractions. I apologize for the inconvenience." James nodded, appreciating the straightforwardness. But as he moved to reboard, he paused, looking back at Claire. "I hope you'll take some time to think about what happened here today," he said, his words measured but impactful. Then, without waiting for a response, he walked down the jet bridge. As James settled back into his seat, the tension in his chest began to ease. But his mind was far from quiet. The incident had left a sour taste, not because of the inconvenience, but because of what it represented. He couldn't shake the feeling that Claire's actions had been rooted in something far more troubling than mere intuition. Meanwhile, back at the gate, Claire stood frozen, her carefully constructed facade beginning to crumble. She had crossed a line, and deep down she knew it. The murmurs of passengers and the quiet disapproval of her colleagues echoed in her ears, a stark reminder that actions have consequences. And as the plane prepared for takeoff, Claire could only watch through the terminal window, a sinking feeling in her chest as she realized this was far from over. The hum of the engines filled the cabin as the plane taxied onto the runway. James sat in his seat, his outward calm belying the storm of thoughts swirling in his mind. He opened his book again but found it impossible to focus. The incident with Claire wasn't just about being inconvenienced. It was a stark reminder of the biases that still lurked in everyday situations, even for someone in his position. His instincts told him there was more to this than met the eye, and he couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. Meanwhile, Claire remained at the gate, her confidence crumbling with each passing moment. The supervisor's words echoed in her mind, along with the captain's look of disapproval. She tried to justify her actions, tried to convince herself that she had acted out of genuine concern. But the young woman's accusation and James' calm but firm demeanor had left her feeling exposed. For the first time, she began to question whether her own assumptions had clouded her judgment. Back on the plane, a flight attendant approached James with a polite smile, offering a refreshment. "Sir, we're sorry for the earlier misunderstanding. Please let us know if there's anything we can do to make your flight more comfortable." James nodded, appreciating the gesture but knowing it didn't erase what had happened. "Thank you," he said simply, his tone neutral. The attendant lingered for a moment, as if sensing the weight of his thoughts, but then retreated to the galley. As the plane climbed into the sky, James allowed himself a moment to reflect on his career. He had faced countless challenges in his line of work: high-stakes negotiations, dangerous field missions, and intricate investigations. But situations like this felt different. They were subtle, insidious, and deeply personal. And while he had no desire to escalate the incident, he couldn't ignore the implications. Elsewhere in the cabin, the young woman who had defended James earlier was seated several rows back, her mind racing with a mix of anger and admiration. She hadn't planned to get involved, but something about the way Claire had treated James had struck a nerve. She thought about her own experiences, how easy it was for people to jump to conclusions based on nothing more than appearances. Her decision to speak up had been impulsive, but now she wondered if it had been enough. Hours passed as the flight continued, the passengers settling into the quiet rhythm of long-distance travel. James, however, remained alert. He couldn't shake the feeling that Claire's actions might not have been entirely her own. His instincts as an agent kicked in, prompting him to replay the events in his mind. Was it possible she had acted on instructions from someone else, or was it truly just a case of personal bias? Either way, the nagging suspicion that there was more to uncover refused to let him rest. At the same time, Claire was grappling with her own turmoil. She had returned to the break room, hoping to avoid further scrutiny from her colleagues. But the whispers had already begun, and she could feel their eyes on her whenever she walked by. She replayed her interactions with James, searching for a way to justify her actions. But the truth was undeniable. She had let her own prejudices cloud her judgment, and now she was beginning to fear the consequences. Unbeknownst to Claire, the airline had already launched an internal review. The supervisor, feeling the weight of the situation, had reported the incident to higher management, knowing it would likely lead to questions about Claire's conduct. Meanwhile, the young woman who had defended James had taken to social media, sharing her account of what had happened. The post quickly gained traction, sparking a wave of outrage and support for James. As the plane began its descent, James noticed a flurry of activity among the crew. Whispers and hurried exchanges suggested that news of the incident had reached beyond the confines of the flight. James' phone buzzed as soon as the plane touched down, a string of messages from colleagues and friends flooding his screen. Word had spread, and people wanted answers. Stepping off the plane, James felt the weight of the day settle over him. He knew there would be fallout, both for Claire and for the airline. But more importantly, he felt a responsibility to address what had happened, not just for himself, but for anyone who had ever been subjected to similar treatment. As he walked through the terminal, his mind was already working, considering the next steps. This wasn't just a personal matter. It was an opportunity to shed light on a broader issue. Meanwhile, Claire sat alone in the break room, her hands trembling as she scrolled through her phone. The airline's legal team had reached out, and the tone of their message was clear. She would need to account for her actions. But it wasn't just the potential disciplinary measures that weighed on her. It was the growing realization that she had been wrong. And now she was left to face the consequences of a decision she couldn't take back. As the terminal emptied and the day came to a close, the unresolved tension lingered, leaving everyone involved to wonder what would happen next. The airport was buzzing with its usual chaotic energy, but James moved with purpose through the crowded terminal. His mind was racing, replaying every detail of what had unfolded. By now, news of the incident had spread beyond the confines of the airline, and James had received word from his FBI colleagues that the situation had caught the attention of higher-ups. There were whispers of potential public scrutiny, and James knew his next moves would be critical, not just for himself but for how the story was framed. Meanwhile, Claire sat in a meeting room at the airline's headquarters, her nerves frayed. A stern-looking manager entered with a stack of reports and closed the door behind her. Claire's heart sank as she realized the depth of the investigation. The manager began asking questions, methodical, unrelenting. Every detail was dissected, from her initial intuition to her behavior in the moments after James had identified himself. Each question felt like another crack in the fragile defense she had been clinging to. Back at his hotel, James finally allowed himself to take a breath. His phone continued buzzing with messages, and among them was a voicemail from a prominent journalist. The media had gotten wind of the incident, and it was clear this wasn't going to stay a private matter. James hesitated, debating whether to return the call. He wanted to use his voice for good, to address the broader issues at play, but he also knew how easily things could spiral out of control. At the same time, the young woman who had defended James on the plane was seeing her social media post go viral. The comments were a mixture of outrage, support, and the inevitable internet cynicism. But among the noise were stories, people sharing their own experiences of being unfairly judged or discriminated against. Her post had sparked something bigger than she anticipated, and she realized this was no longer just about one man's experience. It was about systemic issues that needed to be addressed. As the pieces of the story gained momentum, the airline's leadership convened an emergency meeting. The legal and PR teams were scrambling to contain the fallout, drafting statements that balanced accountability with damage control. They knew the public was watching closely, and any misstep could worsen the situation. The captain of the flight, who had vouched for James, was brought into the meeting to provide his perspective. His words carried weight, and the room fell silent as he described the events from his point of view. Claire, still reeling from the intense questioning, was given a brief reprieve but was told not to leave the premises. Alone in the break room, she stared at her phone, her hands trembling as she scrolled through the growing storm of public opinion. Messages from friends and family flooded her inbox, some supportive, others critical. She felt cornered, her earlier confidence replaced by a deep sense of regret. For the first time, she began to grasp the ripple effects of her actions. That evening, James received a call from his supervisor at the bureau. The tone was professional but laced with concern. The bureau was monitoring the situation closely, aware of the potential implications for their agent. James reassured them he was handling it, but as he hung up, he couldn't shake the weight of responsibility. This wasn't just about clearing his name. It was about shining a light on the biases and assumptions that had led to the incident in the first place. As the airline prepared to release an official statement, tensions reached a boiling point. Protesters had begun to gather outside the company's headquarters, demanding accountability and change. News crews swarmed the scene, their cameras capturing the growing unrest. Inside, the leadership team debated their next move, aware that one wrong step could spell disaster. Claire's phone buzzed again, a message from her manager instructing her to meet with the CEO the following morning. Her stomach churned as she realized the gravity of what lay ahead. This wasn't just about her actions anymore. It was about the reputation of the entire company. As the night wore on, James found himself staring out the window of his hotel room, the city lights flickering below. He thought about the countless people who had experienced moments like his, their stories often untold or ignored. This was bigger than him, and he knew it. The question was how to use his voice in a way that would bring about real change. The tension was building, and the stage was set for the story's turning point, but the resolution was still just out of reach. As James gazed out at the city, his phone buzzed again, this time with an email marked urgent. It was from a senior FBI official, requesting a detailed account of the incident and any insights James could provide. While James had expected this, the timing added to the mounting pressure. Before he could begin drafting his response, another notification flashed, a breaking news alert. The headline sent a chill down his spine. Anonymous insider reveals shocking details about airline incident. The article claimed a source within the airline had leaked information suggesting Claire's actions were part of a broader, unofficial policy to scrutinize certain passengers more heavily. The claim, while unverified, implied this was not an isolated incident but part of a pattern. James felt a mix of anger and determination. If true, this was bigger than even he had anticipated. He immediately forwarded the article to his FBI team, knowing it could change the direction of their internal investigation. Claire, on the other hand, was unaware of the article but felt the growing unease of being at the center of a storm. She tried to prepare herself for her meeting with the CEO, but her thoughts kept drifting to the events of the day. The tension reached a breaking point when her phone rang. It was her manager. Before she could even say hello, the voice on the other end was terse. "Did you see the news? You need to get here early tomorrow." This just became much bigger. At the airline's headquarters, the senior leadership team scrambled to contain the fallout from the anonymous leak. The CEO, visibly frustrated, demanded answers from the legal and PR teams. The captain from the flight was called in again, his straightforward demeanor contrasting with the growing panic in the room. The CEO made it clear they needed to act swiftly to address the allegations, but every option seemed fraught with risk. As James prepared his report for the bureau, another unexpected twist emerged. His phone rang, displaying a number he didn't recognize. Hesitant but curious, he answered. A low, steady voice introduced itself as a former employee of the airline. The caller claimed to have insider knowledge about discriminatory practices and offered to provide documentation. Jane's instincts kicked in. This could be the breakthrough needed to confirm whether the incident with Claire was part of a larger issue. The next morning, Claire arrived at the headquarters early, her nerves frayed. She walked into the meeting room, where the CEO sat at the head of the table, flanked by senior executives. The atmosphere was heavy, and Claire could feel the weight of their gazes. Before the meeting began, the CEO slid a printed copy of the article across the table. "Do you know anything about this?" the CEO asked, a tone icy. Claire shook her head, her voice faltering. I don't know who could have said this." The CEO leaned back, studying her. "Whether or not it's true, this situation is spiraling, and you're at the center of it." Meanwhile, James met with the whistleblower in a discreet location. The former employee handed over a stack of documents, detailing years of internal communications, suggesting implicit biases in the airline's policies. As James flipped through the pages, his suspicions were confirmed. This was no isolated incident. It was systemic. The whistleblower also shared their own experiences, painting a damning picture of the airline's culture. James thanked them and promised to follow up, knowing this evidence could shift the entire narrative. As the day unfolded, news of the leaked documents began to circulate, adding fuel to the fire. Protesters outside the airline's headquarters grew in number, their chants echoing through the streets. Inside, the leadership team debated their next steps. Claire, feeling increasingly cornered, wondered if she had been set up to take the fall for deeper issues within the company. For the first time, she considered the possibility that she might not have been acting entirely on her own judgment, but influenced by an unspoken culture of bias. The stakes were higher than ever, and every decision now carried immense weight. For James, Claire, and the airline, the next moves would determine not only the outcome of this specific incident, but also how the broader issues of bias and accountability would be addressed or ignored. The stage was set for a confrontation that none of them could have anticipated.